Greg Palast joins us in the studio. Greg, you might know him from Our Madhouse, Vulture's Picnic, Best Democracy Money Can Buy. And in fact, you got an update, Greg. Best Democracy Money Can Buy, The Case of the Stolen Election.
That's a new film.
That's the new film. But that was actually about the 2016 election.
That was how Trump, so I've changed it to The Case of the Stolen Election, because before the election, I said, this is how Trump's gonna steal the election. Everyone bought their party dress for the inauguration. No one took me seriously. So now the new edition is called This Is How He Stole, called The Case of the Stolen Election.
Yeah. Well, we were among the few people who were warning that that he certainly could win. And so now you got, unfortunately, a potential new stolen election, and that's Georgia.
Georgia, absolutely. So what happened is, in the case of Georgia, Brian Kemp, with the help, by the way, of his buddy Chris Kobach of Kansas, purged over 500,000 voters. In 2017, you can imagine 500,000 voters in just Georgia. I sued Kemp, and I got the list of every person that was purged, every single name, all their addresses, all the information about them, handed it over to a team of experts. And he said about like 500,000 people left the state. Like there must have been moving vans everywhere, moved out of Atlanta. We went through name by name, the experts, and said 340,134 voters had never moved, were removed from the voter rolls because they supposedly disappeared from Georgia or the county where they voted. You're talking 1/3 voters who are canned with no notice, no notice. They showed up en masse, and they were either handed provisional ballots, which were thrown in the garbage, and about 50,000 people were simply in violation of federal law, even denied the provisional ballot. But here's the deal. I mean, you have to understand, some of the people, and I was there filming. You got, for example, Christine Jordan, 92 years old, the cousin of Martin Luther King, voted the same place for 50 years. They wouldn't give her a ballot. And this was typical. I was going all over Atlanta and all over the state.
So, Greg, what was their justification for not giving provisional ballots?
Because Kemp is in charge. Well, Kemp, let's put it this way. Kemp is Secretary of State. He's the candidate. So he asked the Secretary of State what should be the rule. And the Secretary of State himself said, don't give out the ballots. Now, it's a violation of federal law, but it was brilliant, because Stacey Abrams was ready to fight over counting the provisional ballots, and she got a judge to say count them, but you can't count provisional ballots which were never handed out.
So if the race was about a 1.5 point difference, but it was actually much narrower than that when you looked at what would have required a runoff.
Yeah, it was a few thousand votes, about
just
6,000.
a few thousand votes, and they would have needed a runoff.
Look, it was a pure steal. But here's the thing, it wasn't just Georgia. This is where everyone was focused. But the trick that Brian Kemp used was developed by some GOP masterminds, including one Chris Kobach of Kansas, who designed programs to help them literally just burn through the voter rolls and bleach them whiter than white. They used methods which were absolutely designed to remove voters of color, young voters. It was very difficult for young voters to vote, including my daughter down in Georgia. And it was just brilliant. For example, Chris Kobach, who's the Secretary of State of Kansas, I know he lost the governorship, but he's not, part of it was because he was running around the country bleaching voter rolls, and people in Kansas resented that. But for example, he used a program called Interstate Cross-Check, 26 states. This is supposed to find double voters. Who are the double voters? People with names like Maria Hernandez. So they'll find a Maria Hernandez in Atlanta, Georgia, and a Maria Hernandez in Virginia. This is a real example, Maria Inez Hernandez versus Maria Cristina Hernandez. They said it's the same voter because Maria Hernandez is not a common name for a Republican. They used this to purge. In Georgia, there were 108,000 people on Chris Kobach's purge list for Georgia that was sent to Kemp in Georgia, 108,000. And what Kemp says, well, we're not saying these people voted twice, they just moved to that other state. Well, we checked, and 106,000 of them, and we went name by name, 106,000 of them had never moved anywhere, but they lost their right to vote. This is the practice for 2020. This is the danger.
So for people who don't know the issue well, and they just know it superficially, and they hear on cable news, well, I mean, who wouldn't have a voter ID? Or, well, but look, wait a minute, if it's the same guy, you don't, or the same person, you don't want them voting twice. And then the one of the main things that they'll say about cross-check, for example, is, but a white guy could have the same name too. So how do you know they're targeting Democratic voters or black voters or Latinos?
We have their names, so we know their race. The other thing is, here's the trick. If you're using common names, 85 of the 100 most common names in America, Rodriguez, Garcia, Jackson, 85 of the 100 most common names in America are minority names. And you're hitting Asian Americans very hard, which has become, I mean, they vote like they've turned black, about 75% Democratic now. And so they're really hitting hard. The other thing, the other trick that they use with this is that you don't lose your vote simply because you're on one of Kobach's lists or one of Kemp's hit lists. You get a postcard. And they say, well, what's the big deal? You get a, return a postcard. Again, well, here's the big deal. If you're a renter, you don't get the card or you don't return it. My daughter was a student in Savannah. She doesn't get the card. She loses her vote. So they're sending out postcards, and they know, here's an interesting statistic from the Census Bureau. If you're black, a renter, low income, and young, you're about, and versus if you're white and homeowner and older, you're about 700% more likely to return that postcard because you get the card. These are people who return cards, et cetera.
Yeah.
So they know what they're doing.
So they do, and they have a number of methods, and you point out a lot of them. And so one is the common name. So if you're Asian American, do you know how many Dave Kims there are, or John Parks, or the last name Lee? So are there white people with the last name Jackson or Lee? Yes. Okay, but there are far more common in the Asian community for Lee, African American community for Jackson, et cetera. And they've done the studies on it. The Republicans already know, well, that's a good way of disproportionately getting rid of Democratic voters and the voter ID. 8% of white people in this country don't have
Passport.
A passport or a driver's license. They don't have photo ID, right? 8% of white people. But 25% of African Americans don't have a photo ID. And a lot of them live in bigger cities, and they don't have a car,
right,
et cetera.
Exactly. You know what? Believe it or not, the people who don't have driver's licenses are people who don't have cars. They're the people who live in the city, or they don't have the money for a car. Guess who they are? They're called, you know what color they are? Blue Democrats. Okay, so they understand exactly how to bleach out the blue. I mean, it's racial. That's the other thing, is that by hitting by the racial aspect, you also get less sympathy and less protection from even the Democratic Party. What makes Stacey Abrams revolutionary is not just that she's the first African-American woman nominated by the Democratic Party, but one of the first to stand up and say, I'm not conceding this race. Technically she hasn't conceded. That's so she can maintain legal standing to challenge these tricks. I'm providing our technical information. I literally have the names of people illegally removed, 340,134 people. I have the exact name and address.
Greg, so your lawsuit's interesting. Jesse Jackson's joined it, right?
Yes, Jesse Jackson, and yes.
And so what's a possible remedy here? Because they're going to say, well, Kemp's the governor, we're done with it.
Well, number one, because Stacey Abrams hasn't conceded. Under Georgia law, if you have a fatally tainted election, it can be run again. But most important, I think what she's focusing on, and this will have national implications, is to say this type of targeted, racist, BS purging of the voter rolls, to say people have moved when they haven't left their home, to say people have died when they're still walking around, to say people are voting in 2 states when it's hard enough to get people to vote in 1. This game has to end. And so as a candidate, she has the legal status to challenge these things. And it's not just Georgia. Georgia was the worst example, and of course it changed the outcome of the race. But you're talking about something which is affecting Ohio, which is affecting obviously, Kansas. We're talking about Louisiana, Alabama, Michigan. That was huge in Michigan. Supposedly Donald Trump won Michigan by 10,700 votes. Well, they purged 60,000 voters of color on Kobach's say-so that these people had moved out of Michigan. Okay, so again, it's not just Georgia, and it's just that Stacey Abrams is saying, I stand here, I'm not moving, I'm still technically in the race, and I'm gonna sue your behind off.
But so what's the remedy across the nation? Obviously, Michigan now has a Democratic governor. Maybe she can do something about the voter purges, so that's good. But in places where the Republicans are in charge, can the courts get them to stop purging the voters disproportionately, or do you just have to live with it in Louisiana for the rest of your life?
Well, I've got legal teams literally operating in 26 states to get the information and to bust this open. Two things can happen. One, when you get the information, there's a lot of Americans, no matter what party they're in, think in the democracy everyone should be allowed to vote. A lot of people get pissed off. It's one of the things that hurt Chris Kobach. People didn't like him being the purgeon general for the Trump administration. So Americans get pissed off when people are removed of all political stripes. The second is that the courts can absolutely act. They can say, look, you have evidence in your face that people have not moved. You remove them for having moved out of the state. They didn't do it. Just because Chris Kobach says so, guess what? That's not the law. Chris Kobach is not the law, even though he thinks he is. So you do have to count on federal judges, and you have to make sure that you don't get the court date raped at the Supreme. So you have to there's a strategy, frankly, to keep it out of the Supreme Court, because I don't trust them to not come up with just a political decision.
All right, Greg Palast on the case as usual. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.